Morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's session on the importance of addressing modern slavery in a just transition. Just a bit of an introduction from myself. There's a lot of names on here who I haven't seen before, so hopefully this is the first time we've met, and if not, nice to meet you again. So yeah, I'm Anna Campwell. I'm a senior consultant at Action Sustainability. Action Sustainability is the consultancy behind the Supply Chain Sustainability School as well. So within that space, I work in human rights and sustainable procurement. So I've been with Action Sustainability nearly 3 years now. And prior to that, I was working as a consultant over in Australia. And then prior to that, I worked in-house as a sustainable procurement manager. So I've got a bit of that in-house experience and consultancy experience. At Action Sustainability, we've worked with a lot of different clients on modern slavery work, and I'll go into a bit of detail on one of the projects we did a couple of years ago, which focused very much on a renewable technology, which is maybe where some of you have heard of us from. That guidance document that we produced became very popular, actually. So for those new faces, I will run through that briefly as well. So it's a good resource to share. So lovely to meet you all this morning. I have my Calendly link on the screen here on a QR code, and it'll be shared in the chat as well throughout. If you want to set up a discovery call with myself, feel free to use that Calendly link and set up a call. My email's also on there, so if you want to contact me following this session, feel free to do that. We have a Q&A function open this morning, so pop your questions in the Q&A function, and I'll keep an eye throughout the session this morning, but we'll also keep some time back at the end to answer any questions that come through. So I mentioned a guide that we developed very much in alignment with what we're here to talk about this morning, the Just Transition. And we published it in 2023 with support from some funding partners. And those funding partners came from government, utilities, home companies, water companies, building materials and service suppliers, and tier one contractors. And we also got support from Solar Energy UK and the Solar Stewardship Initiative to develop this procurement guidance document on addressing modern slavery and labour exploitations in solar PV supply chains. So what this guidance document does, and again, follow the QR code here, and I'll also send a link following this session where you can go and download it. It highlights modern slavery and labour exploitation risks and the impacts of that in the solar supply chain. And it also includes steps to address those issues throughout that life cycle of purchasing solar PV. It has lots of practical tips and guidance for the procurement due diligence process. And we'll touch on a few of those points a little later this morning as well. This guidance document is available free to download on our website, so please head over there and download it. It will probably provide a bit more information in addition to what we're covering this morning, because we obviously only have a short amount of time together. And it also points to some really good resources that are available, a lot of them for free as well. So just to get started this morning, to get to know this audience a little bit more, I'd like you all, in the usual Action Sustainability style, to head over to menti.com. So if you can head to menti.com and enter the code that's on the screen, 59002265, or scan the QR code and head to menti.com. We've just got a couple of questions just to get to know you a little bit better. So that's menti.com and the code 59002265, and then we'll get started. So I can see some of you are starting to join there now, which is good. Just give you a little bit longer and then we'll get started with the Menti. Okay. So the first question, rather broad, why are you interested in the just transition? So anything that you can think of, why is it that you're interested in the just transition? What made you register for this webinar this morning? More knowledge? Fairness, regulations, solidarity, keeping up to date, updating supply or something, people focused, insights, to understand the topic, doing the right thing, some advice, a holistic approach, education, curiosity, sustainability, inclusive, empathy, support our strategies. That's good to know. Hints and tips. Yeah. Deliver to others. No, that's great. Ethics. Yeah, no, that's great. So that's good for me to know sort of what's drawing people to this topic. And then a little bit sort of narrowing down on that, I suppose, is it'd be good to know what renewable solutions do you purchase, sell, or use as an organisation? Is that solar PV? Is it wind? Is it hydro, biomass, geothermal, or tidal? And it potentially isn't that you are currently purchasing, selling, or using, but you're planning to. Just what are those most? What's the split in terms of the ones that people are using on this session today? So solar very much seems to be the most popular, whether that's because of the very much clear link with the just transition or because it's one of the most easiest to install, I suppose, as an organisation. Okay, so solar and then biomass and then wind are the clear leaders here. That's interesting to know. So then now we're thinking more about what are the issues. So what issues do you think are associated with the just transition? Is it just job displacement? Is it Indigenous rights, modern slavery, inequality, skills and training, funding, or all of them and more? Yeah, I probably copped out a little bit easy on this one and put that all of them and more on the end here. Um, but typically, when you look at sort of media talking about just transition, or even some utilities companies talking about just transition, they very, very much focus on that job displacement part. So looking at the jobs and the skills and the training. So obviously workers in the fossil fuels industry, such as coal, oil and gas, with that shift to green economies, they're facing job losses. And then obviously the green jobs require different skills, or they might be located in a different region, or they don't always match in the working conditions or the pay. So that job displacement and the lack of skills and training is a very popular area that's associated with just transition, especially in the media. But you also have that regional inequality because obviously some areas are more dependent on those carbon intensive industries. We've obviously seen that in the UK with coal. So, you know, certain areas are very, very predominantly the employment in those areas are around the coal industry. So that really, really leads to underinvestment in those areas and regions. Um, You've got economic disruption as well, so it can destabilize the local economies. So some economies are obviously very reliant on fossil fuels. Um, in addition to this, you've also got political resistance. So you know it can be a very political conversation when we talk about just transition. There are some challenges that say the just transition is a bit of an excuse, or the challenges associated with the just transition are a bit of an excuse to not transition to renewables, and that can obviously be linked with people wanting to push the economy that's associated with fossil fuels as well. So it's quite a touchy topic sometimes. We've obviously got that inclusion and social justice part, and where you're looking at marginalised groups such as Indigenous people. So in a lot of the areas that are linked with renewables. You've got Indigenous people who are being sort of moved out of their homes, or their land is being stolen in some instances. And then another area here that no one clicked on, but I think is a big part, it's that funding and implementation. So scaling up on renewables requires a lot of public investment in infrastructure, and job programs and the social side of it. So political will and sustained funding can sometimes be hard to secure. So there's a lot of issues that touch on just transition. Then the final question I have for you all, has your organisation started to put things in place to manage the just transition? And this is just purely out of interest. Yep, so a few of you say yes, some of you say about to start, and a lot of you say no, which is exactly how I expected it to be, actually. And I'll go into a few of sort of the drivers which has maybe driven you to be here, and to start to think about putting some measures in place for the just transition. Okay, so we'll head back to the slides now. So very basically, a recap here, what is the just transition? So as we're moving to a more sustainable and equitable future, the concept of just transition is becoming increasingly vital. So the transition isn't just about shifting to cleaner and greener industries, it's about ensuring that the people and communities most impacted by these changes are supported, valued and empowered. So in a nutshell, it's putting people at the heart of climate action. It was part of the Paris Agreement in 2015, and it's set out in the ILO's, so the International Labour Organization's 2015 Just Transition Guidelines as well. So why is the just transition essential? First and foremost, it's the right thing to do. So design the transition to respect human rights and reduce poverty and inequality. It's the necessary thing to do, so to strengthen public trust and support by anticipating that distributional concern. And it's the smart thing to do, so to build the social foundations for a thriving, net zero, resilient and nature positive economy. So not having people at the heart of that transition, it's just not going to be a sustainable transition, is it? It's going to really, really disadvantage a lot of places. So again, in a nutshell, the transition won't happen unless it's fair. Unless it's fair, the transition would probably take longer. It will probably cost more in the long run. So having that sort of broader thought and view, including people at the heart of that climate action and climate transition, is really, really important. So what are the top priorities of the just transition? A good resource if you're interested in reading up more on the Just Transition is the Just Transition Finance Lab. They were launched in February 2024 at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and they have a goal of being a centre for experimentation and excellence in the financial solutions needed for a just transition. So this is just a breakdown of a resource that they developed here. So these are the top priorities that they are saying are for the just transition. So priority 1, opportunities. Identify and maximise the social opportunities of the transition. Priority 2 is risks. So anticipating, minimising and managing the social risks of the transition. Then 3, ensuring social dialogue and participation of affected stakeholders. And then 4, that transformation piece, so seeking out ways to bring systemic change through climate action. And within those 4 priorities, there are 4 key people groups which should be considered as part of the just transition. So you have workers, so involving workers by anticipating their employment shifts, respecting rights at work, ensuring dialogue, developing skills, protecting health and safety, and providing that social protection such as pensions and benefits. Then we have suppliers, so supporting suppliers and taking account of social impact on the path to net zero, strengthening local supply chains, applying labour, human rights and environmental due diligence along the supply chain. So we'll get into that due diligence piece in a moment's time. We also have communities, so understanding the spillover effect for communities, respecting rights around impact and involvement, and focusing on vulnerability, enabling innovations such as community energy. And then the final one is consumers. So prioritising implications for consumers with inadequate access to sustainable goods and services, including energy, removing barriers to the consumers to support the transition, including through financial services. So when we look at this, very much modern slavery fits into the just transition in a crucial way as it highlights that intersection between social justice, labour rights and environmental sustainability. A just transition is ensuring that the shift towards a greener economy doesn't leave vulnerable workers behind. So that's very much where modern slavery fits into the just transition, and you can see how it fits into these priorities here on the screen. What are the modern slavery risks associated with the just transition? So we have clean energy supply chains. The production of clean energy technologies often relies on complex and global supply chains, many of which involve labour rights concerns. So mentioned before, solar panels, polysilicon, which is a key material in solar panels, is very much linked to forced labour in China. Then we have wind turbines, which are rare earth metals, have rare earth metals included, such as the neodymium, and they're often sourced from countries with poor labour regulations. And then you've also electric vehicle batteries, which has lithium, cobalt, and nickel, all of which are critical to the batteries. But cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo is notorious for child labour and forced labour. So you've got 3 examples there which involve labour rights concerns, and they are very much entwined with the technologies on renewables. Then we have the mining boom for green technology. So the transition requires a massive scale up of mining operations for critical minerals in areas like the DRC, Indonesia, Bolivia, and Peru. Those countries have weak labour protections, they've got corruption and poverty, which all increases that vulnerability exploitation. In addition to that, you've also got artisanal and small-scale mining as well, which often lacks regulation and oversight, creating environments which are just rife for child labour and debt bondage. So we have the supply chains for clean energy combined with the mining boom for green tech. And then in addition to that, you've got the supply chains there, and you've got the minerals that are involved and the processes of that. But then here you've also got the third one, which is that construction of renewable infrastructure. So that rapid expansion of solar farms, wind farms, hydropower plants, that often involves migrant workers, which are sometimes working under exploitative conditions, especially in countries with lax labour laws and poor enforcement. And we don't just see that overseas, you can see that here. But where we have seen it quite rife is projects in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. They've faced allegations of forced labour, wage withholding and confiscation of documents within that construction of renewable infrastructures. The fourth one we have on the screen here is agricultural shifts. So this is linking very much to biofuel and carbon offsets, which is part of that just transition. So biofuel production can lead to lots of land grabs, displacement of indigenous communities, and exploitative labour practices in sugarcane or palm oil plantations. So when you think of those ingredients involved in biofuel production, that's very much the labour intensive farming of that can be linked to exploitative labour practices. Then you have carbon offset programs. So in the global south, that can lead to forced relocation and labour exploitation in forestry or conservation initiatives. So when people are buying carbon offsets, which people are doing as part of their transition, it should be, due diligence should also take place on those carbon offset programs. And then the final one that we have on the screen here, the fifth one, is that lack of due diligence in new industries. So I would say this is a new thing, but it has been going on for some time. But as new green sectors emerge quite quickly, human rights safeguarding might lag behind a little. So that creates opportunity for bad actors to exploit workers in informal or unregulated parts of that green economy. And there's a few hotspots that are associated with this. So we've got Africa, which has the DRC very much linked with cobalt. You've got Madagascar, which is linked with graphite, and you've got Zambia, which is linked with copper. Then in Asia, you have China, where you've got manufacturing. You've got Indonesia, which is linked with nickel. And in India, you've got solar and biofuel labour. Then in Latin America, you've got Brazil, Peru, and Bolivia, all linked with mining and agriculture. So with those 5 areas, you can see how much modern slavery risks are associated with the just transition. And it's not just very much when you think about, what's sometimes in the media with modern slavery linked to just transition is very much the polysilicon and solar panels. You can see how it touches on lots of different areas. There's some really good resources that you can check out for more information on risks. So you have the Global Slavery Index, and I'll pop all of these in the chat actually. So you've got the Global Slavery Index. The Walk Free Foundation have produced a Beyond Compliance Renewable Energy Sector publication, which is really interesting. You've got the US list of goods produced by child labour or forced labour. You have Material Insights, which has really good information on things like batteries. You also have Design for Freedom's recently published International Guidance and Toolkit, and you have the Danish Institute for Human Rights have published something on human rights and solar energy. So I will just copy and paste this information now into the chat so you've all got those links available. So what can be done? As you can see, lots of different touch points on modern slavery risk within the just transition. So what can be done? Let's start with governments. Governments are starting to enforce mandatory human rights due diligence laws for companies. So for a big example of this is the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. A lot of you are probably very well aware what that is, but in a nutshell, what it's doing, it's designed to require companies to identify, prevent, mitigate, and remedy actual and potential impacts on human rights and the environment in their operations, subsidiaries, and value chains. So it's applicable to companies with 500 plus employees and 150 million euro turnover globally. And what it's asking them to do is to conduct due diligence, so to map their supply chains and identify actual or potential risks to human rights and the environment. It's asking them to integrate policies, so to establish and update their due diligence policies, risk assessments and action plans, and to take preventative and corrective action, so change suppliers or practices if risks are found, and work with suppliers to address issues. It's also requiring establishing grievance mechanisms, so to create a safe, accessible channel for affected victims and communities to report concerns. And it's also asking to monitor and report, so evaluating the effectiveness of their due diligence measures and public report findings and updates. An important one, which we're seeing a huge increase in uptake, is also that requirement to produce a climate transition plan. So for large companies, they're now going to be required to produce a climate transition plan. So that's aligning business models with the Paris Agreement and net transition goals. So in addition to this, several countries have developed just transition frameworks. So we have the CSDDD, but other countries are starting to develop just transition frameworks as part of their climate strategies, which is aiming to shift to a low carbon economy whilst minimising social and economic disruptions. So some of the examples of these countries include South Africa. So they have a Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, and that's very much focusing on decarbonisation, reskilling, economic diversification, and they have their Presidential Climate Commission overseeing that. You've also got a framework in Spain, so you've got a Just Transition Strategy in Spain, which focuses very much around the closure of coal mines with guarantees of employment or early retirement. So it's protecting the workers involved in those coal mines. Chile has their national just transition strategy. You've got Germany, which again, that's very much on their coal phase out, but making sure that compensation is there for workers and investment in affected regions. You have the US, who have their Justice 40 and Just Transition Fund. So again, that's community investment and economic diversification. You have Canada, which is their Just Transition Task Force, which is focusing very much on a sustainable jobs plan. You've got European Union, they have a Just Transition mechanism, and you've got New Zealand, who have their Just Transition partnership. So we're starting to see governments more and more put these new Just Transition frameworks, plans, or whatever we want to call them in place. In the UK, we don't necessarily have that in place. However, just last week, it was announced in a significant policy shift, the UK Energy Secretary Ed Miliband announced that Great British Energy, the state-owned clean energy company, will be prohibited from using solar panels, wind turbines and batteries linked to forced labour, particularly those involving polysilicon sourced from China's Xinjiang region. This move follows pressure from Labour MPs, campaigners and human rights advocates concerned about the human rights abuses against the Uyghur Muslims in China. So you can see more information on that in our guidance document that we shared the link to. That's where a substantial proportion of the world's polysilicon, a key component in solar panels, is produced under forced labour, so state-imposed forced labour. The decision marks a reversal from the government's previous stance, where Labour MPs were sort of instructed to reject amendments. But this new amendment to the Great British Energy Bill commits the government to measures ensuring that slavery and human trafficking don't occur in GB Energy's business or supply chains. So this policy is very specific to GB Energy, and it doesn't actually extend to private companies. However, you could argue that this ban could sort of filter into the way that other areas of purchasing, government policy does seem to filter down and affect private companies as well. So that was a really, really important shift that was announced last week, and it's very much linked with just transition. So mentioned in the overview of CSDDD, integrating the social into climate transition plans. So under CSDDD, large companies are required to develop a climate transition plan. And this here integrates just transition into climate plans. So a climate transition plan outlines how a company aligns its business model and operations with the Paris Agreement goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. And it sets targets and milestones to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Here we have it integrating climate risks into corporate strategy and risk management. So on the screen here, we have the Transition Plan Task Force guidance on their disclosure framework. And the areas which include just transition are highlighted in yellow. So if you're developing your climate transition plan, check out the TPT's guidance and very much note those yellow areas on how it's important to bring just transition into the climate plans required by the new EU legislation. And interestingly, we've seen clients start who aren't required by the EU legislation to build their own climate transition plans as well. And so it's important to include just transition in there, and not just transition in regards to jobs, but very, very much keeping modern slavery in there. So what is it that you could do? What are some of the things that you can do to include just transition when you're purchasing renewables? So embedding modern slavery due diligence into your procurement process. So when we start with our procurement process, we have, you are identifying your needs. So what we have on the screen here, we have round the edge, we have a typical procurement process. Then in the middle, we have a typical due diligence process, and we have overlapped where due diligence sits into the procurement process. So when we start procurement activity, you want to understand the need. So at the beginning of any procurement process, understanding business needs is essential. Traditional business considerations include quality, performance, local regulations, warranties, financial viability, demand, and that life cycle costing. However, when evaluating the need for renewables, additional consideration should be given to environmental impacts and innovation and life cycle impacts, modern slavery and labour exploitation, risk and transparency, and linking those in with your understanding of your needs. So when you think about environmental impacts when you're purchasing renewables, that should include impacts throughout the life cycle, so associated with carbon emissions, resource use, and waste generated. Then when you think of innovation, can you consider alternative technologies that don't rely on high-risk components such as polysilicon? So when you're going out to buy something, think about innovation. Also think about life cycle impacts. Can you lease it rather than purchasing it? How can you maintain something that's already in existence versus repair? And is there an opportunity to buy less? Then you have that modern slavery and labour exploitation risk and transparency. This is an important one when you were thinking of just transition. So consider the need and ability to achieve transparency as far down the supply chain as possible. So that allows you to evaluate the level of risk and design appropriate due diligence strategies, which we'll go into in a moment's time. So in understanding your needs, you must also consider the market's maturity, the policy requirements related to modern slavery and labour exploitation, the different risks and the leverage that you have to address these risks. So these considerations will then help to inform your procurement strategies. Then we have our next stage, which includes identifying and assessing risks. So recognising the risks and identifying where risks of modern slavery and labour exploitation lie in your supply chain is a crucial building block for good due diligence. So it then informs the subsequent activities that you're going to do in your procurement process. What you need to realise as well is that identifying risks is not just a one-off activity, so it should be done throughout the whole contract management phase as well. So it shouldn't just be done at the start before you go out and contract with somebody. It should be done through the whole procurement process and throughout the contract management stage. The potential for risk of modern slavery and labour exploitation should be highlighted at the beginning of the procurement process when deciding to invest in renewables. And then next you need to refine that risk. So identify the location in the supply chains and consider how to mitigate it. So using the procurement process to get more information from your suppliers on where their supply chain is. And also consider risks across the whole life cycle, so from design to the end of life. And this is particularly important when you're developing your procurement approach. So keep in mind that procurement process as we go through this morning's session. So once you've identified your risks, you need to consider what leverage you have or could develop to mitigate those risks through the procurement process. Traditionally, leverage in procurement is determined using financial indicators, so the contract value, but these parameters should be expanded to include broader issues such as the length of relationship. So are you buying renewables as a one-off purchase or part of a programme of work that includes longer-term relationships with suppliers? The place in the supply chain. So where are you in the supply chain? Are you the ultimate client who will be utilising the renewable technology? Are you a broker, an installer, a designer or manufacturer? So where do you sit in the supply chain? The reputation and trust. So is your organisation strategically important to your supply chain? Do the supply chain members like working with you? And are the relationships mutually beneficial? Innovation. Do you have funds or ambitions to support innovation and continuous improvement in the supply chain? Market maturity. So is the market fragmented and immature in understanding and responding to the issue of modern slavery and labour exploitation? Can you create awareness in the market? Can you be there to make the market more mature in that space? So collaboration as well. Are you part of a collaborative initiative or a group tackling modern slavery and labour exploitation on these issues in renewables? Resilience. Do you have the freedom and flexibility to move supply chains if unsatisfied with your supply chain's approach to addressing the risk of modern slavery? Responsibility. So how responsible are you for modern slavery and labour exploitation practices in the supply chain? Are you causing? Are you contributing? Are you linking to it? So then once you understand how much leverage you have by considering all those things, you would then need to consider how best you can use or increase this leverage and work with your supply chain to mitigate any identified risks. A report by the Shift Project called Using Leverage in Business Relationships to Reduce Human Rights outlines 5 ways that leverage can be used or increased. So once you've considered your risk and leverage, use that knowledge to inform your procurement strategy. So the diagram on the screen here is from that Shift project report, and it illustrates how you can increase your leverage from traditional commercial leverage to engagement in multi-stakeholder collaborations. So you can see at the top of that pyramid is sort of your traditional commercial leverage. So you buy something and that's it. Then you can increase your leverage by going to the next level with business leverage. So activity outside the routine. So can you build the capacity, how much you're buying? Then the next one up is business partnering. So using collective action with other companies to increase that leverage. Then you've got bilateral engagement. So you can see here that's where you wouldn't just use business partnering. That's where you would call on government, you would engage with international organisations and civil society organisations. So you're using a more collaborative approach to increase the leverage. So by increasing sort of the message and signalling to the market by lots of different stakeholders, focusing in on modern slavery in that renewables sector. Then you've got that multi-stakeholder collaboration. So that's where you would engage collectively with business peers, governments and industry organisations on a consistent basis to really say, this is our stance, this is where we're going with this. If all of us are on the same page, the supply chain will have to follow and will have to comply and start to take it seriously. So what we can see here is collaboration really does play a vital role here. So that's the next thing I want to touch on is collaborate and advocate. So first things first, if you're wanting to gain more access to resources and a support network of peers facing similar challenges to yourself when purchasing renewables, following on from the solar panel paper we did in 2023, those involved in the development have continued to meet on a quarterly basis. So that's something that we manage at Action Sustainability. That network discusses challenges, insights, they share case studies, and they're exploring broadening a new piece of work onto other renewable technologies such as batteries and wind. So if you fancy joining that network, feel free to send me an email. My email was obviously on the screen before, or set up a discovery call with myself. Our next session we're going to be scheduled in June. So if you want to be part of a network that discusses the issues around purchasing renewables with modern slavery, feel free to reach out and we can invite you to those sessions. Along with collaborate, you've got to advocate. So advocate for governments to set just transition frameworks. So business dialogue with governments can really signal the importance of a just transition. Just transition is at the heart of climate strategy. And so really businesses have that voice to push governments to take action. And public finance for just transition uses tax incentives, carbon revenues, policy banks to boost that private investment. So by advocating for government, that can really be that the change we need for supply chains to start taking this more seriously. An example of this is in the EU. There is a battery regulation, so that came out in 2023, and that battery regulation mandates due diligence obligations for large companies placing batteries on the EU market. So as an organisation, if you want more leverage and want more drivers within your organisation to make different purchasing decisions when it comes to renewables, advocating for government to set these regulations in place is a great place to start. And just as an insight, that EU battery regulation requires organisations to put due diligence management systems in place on the risks related to human rights and environmental impacts through battery supply chains. It requires them to do risk assessment and mitigation, so especially on the sourcing of raw materials. It's requiring a grievance mechanism in place, and it's requiring annual reporting and independent audits as well. So going back to our procurement process and our due diligence process, we have covered how we identify the need. We've covered how you identify and assess risks and the importance of it. So now we're going to develop a procurement strategy. So develop and implement strategy, which very much links to selecting suppliers and managing your contracts. So once you've identified the risks, you've understood the market and the supply chain and considered your leverage, you can develop your procurement approach. So this may be a procurement or category strategy, or even a corporate strategy that outlines your organisational approach to addressing that risk. So when it comes to sourcing and selection, supplier pre-qualification is crucial in helping identify and select suppliers who prioritise due diligence in their supply chains. It also indicates to the market that due diligence is a prerequisite, which may prompt broader behaviour change. Having a policy and commitment in place is great, but also ensuring that suppliers are demonstrating a clear commitment to eradicating modern slavery and labour exploitation in their supply chains. So suppliers should be required to provide a comprehensive policy statement outlining their approach to addressing modern slavery in their supply chains. And that should go beyond mere adherence to laws and international standards. That should really be, how are they assessing and addressing their risks? Verify that suppliers comply with local labour laws and they're adhering to the internationally recognised standards for fair and safe working conditions. That could include certifications such as ISO 45001 for occupational health and safety, or SA 8000 for social accountability. Also, you should require suppliers to disclose relevant information about their supply chain. So that includes their tiers, the locations, the identities of subcontractors involved in production process. So that information helps you assess the potential risks of modern slavery, and it enables you to address the issues proactively. If a supplier can't provide that information, this can be included as part of the tendering process and then embedded into your contractual requirements. So where there's a gap in the information they're providing, in your tendering process, require that they then start to investigate and they start to put a process in place, and then you can monitor their improvement on that commitment that they've made throughout the contract management phase. We have some good tips in our solar PV guidance document on where you can get support with supply chain transparency and verification as well. So that transparency and disclosure piece is really important when you're setting your procurement strategy. Requesting suppliers to provide evidence of social audits is important too. So something that's conducted by a third-party auditor. Those audits should evaluate labour practices, identify risks, and confirm compliance with ethical standards. And again, there's some really good tips on auditing in our solar panel guidance document, especially around the limitations on auditing in certain parts of the world. Then you get into recruitment and employment practices. So ensuring that suppliers have transparent and ethical recruitment practices. That might include verifying that suppliers provide fair wages and working hours, maintain appropriate employment contracts, and don't use forced or child labour. So suppliers must demonstrate their commitment to diversity and inclusion as well, and equal opportunities in their workforce. If you identify a risk of slavery or exploitation further down the supply chain, these requirements should be cascaded and evidenced through the supplier's own supply chain selection and due diligence process. In addition to this, you should encourage suppliers to provide training and capacity programs to enhance their staff and supply chain awareness of modern slavery. So suppliers should be expected to demonstrate their commitment to continuous improvement in this area. And then also stress the importance of suppliers having robust systems in place to monitor high-risk suppliers and subcontractors. So suppliers should be able to demonstrate how they ensure that their supply chain meets these standards outlined in those pre-qualification requirements. Then we get into tendering. So to mitigate the risks associated with modern slavery, you should incorporate specific tendering requirements that prioritise addressing the issues that you've identified. So tendering requirements establish expectations for the successful supplier's ongoing due diligence through the lifetime of the contract that you'll have in place. So here you should consider how you can incentivise a successful supplier. You could develop procurement weightings that incentivise suppliers to provide a mapped supply chain, conduct ethical audits, and evidence improvements. So consider alternatives and innovation, provide closed loop solutions that extend the life of components, and favour low carbon production methods. So use tendering requirements and incentivise tendering requirements to take action to address their risks. Add your policy to your tender documents, so highlight your commitment to eradicating modern slavery. And that should outline your expectation from suppliers and subcontractors. So it should set out what it is you're expecting from your suppliers on labour practices, human rights, and adherence to relevant legislation. So here you can then state your commitment to sourcing and from supply chains that can evidence what they're doing on modern slavery. Define specific criteria that requires suppliers to demonstrate their commitment. So that criteria should include compliance with local laws, certification of fair and work safe conditions, adherence to standards, and evidence of responsible supply chain management. So at that point, standards can start to be introduced. So start to introduce standards in your tendering documents. Request due diligence documentation from suppliers to evaluate their compliance, and that might include social audits, certifications, employment policies, recruitment practices, training programs, and some measures to identify, prevent, and mitigate modern slavery. So suppliers should be required to provide evidence to support their responses. So it's not just saying, tick, yes, we have this process in place, actually get them to send over their evidence. Ask them to provide detailed supply chain information. So starting that supply chain mapping process, which includes the identity and location of subcontractors involved in the production process. So that information should relate specifically to the sources of materials provided as part of your procurement requirements. If that information is not available, then embed a requirement to produce that supply chain map through the life of the contract. So take that as if they cannot provide you with the information now, put in the contract that you'll work together to build a supply chain map of the products that they're providing to you. Include provisions that require suppliers to implement systems for monitoring reporting on labour practices. So suppliers should be expected to report on any concerns and their efforts to address and remediate any issues. And stress the importance of collaboration between your organisation and the successful supplier to address any issues of modern slavery. So suppliers should be encouraged to develop effective remediation plans and engage in ongoing dialogue to prevent future occurrences where remediation is not possible. And clearly then state that consequences for non-compliance should include disqualification from the tender process or contract termination should the suppliers fail to undertake due diligence or support your efforts to undertake due diligence. So you want to be selecting suppliers that are really taking this seriously. Standards can be a part of a broader toolkit to support due diligence activities, and they provide validated data and intelligence that supports your due diligence strategy and response. So some examples of standards include EPEAT. So EPEAT have a standard for solar. You've also got the Responsible Business Alliance. They have a code of conduct and tools that help companies assess and improve their supply chain practices, and they include audits to verify. And you've also now got the Solar Stewardship Initiative, which has developed standards to address modern slavery within the solar supply chain. So those standards are covered in the ESG standard and the Supply Chain Traceability Standard, which together aim to ensure ethical practices throughout the solar industry. If you're interested in more information for that, we can put you in touch with SSI if you're more interested in their approach or it's something you're interested in. And then you look at that final part of the due diligence and procurement process, contract management. So some top tips on contract management to consider. Select an appropriate contract owner. So make sure the right person in your organisation owns that due diligence requirement. Often what we see is, you do a lot of great effort throughout the procurement process. Then when it gets to the contract management, all of that things that were discussed regarding modern slavery due diligence is just dropped off. So the requirement to undertake due diligence and understand the supply chain should be separate from the contract managers responsible for the successful delivery of renewables projects. So there should be someone impartial that's really continuing that conversation once the renewables have been purchased. Again, set a collaborative tone. So the supply chain might need your support in accessing data from their supply chain, understanding the data or making decisions on the data. Help your suppliers, work with them and recognise your ultimate responsibility for the due diligence instead of just adopting a compliance-focused approach. Speak regularly. So best practice is to embed the contract requirements into your contract management process. So speak to your suppliers at least quarterly, especially at the beginning of the contract, and include discussions about their due diligence activities and any changes to market conditions. Once you've got that contract signed, review risks regularly. Don't just review the risk of modern slavery at the outset. That should be an ongoing process. We mentioned that earlier, but that's something that should be done throughout that contract because these risks change, the markets change, risks are evolving all the time. So doing that on a regular basis is really important. And then, although you manage contract requirements, use the contract management process to upskill and develop the supply chain capability and capacity to address modern slavery risks. So that might include training courses, mentoring, process improvement, and the standardization of data and reporting requirements. So engage and educate your supply chain throughout that contract management process. So that comes to the end of our due diligence and procurement process read through. Um, I haven't seen any questions come through the chat. I'm just going to pause here now to see if anybody has any questions that you might want to ask. Any questions that anyone has? I can't see any that have come through. Again, you've got my email address on here, so feel free to send me an email or set up a discovery call using the Calendly link shared in the chat. If you're interested in joining our quarterly catch-ups where it was very much solar focused, but now we're probably going to start to expand it to broader renewables. If you're interested in that, please feel free to get in touch as well, and we'll invite you to our next session in June. We have a question that's come through. What are the key challenges businesses report when implementing their strategies? So I would say there's two key challenges. One is the lack in transparency that they get from the supply chain, or requiring the supply chain to provide information, especially on this approach, too late in the procurement process. So we've seen some clients who have gone out to buy renewables, and last minute they've come to us and said, oh, we really want to make sure we ask these questions of our supply chain. But by that point, they haven't set a realistic time frame for the suppliers to produce a response or to build their strategy. So it's not just asking suppliers questions, it's being prepared to know what to do when you've received the responses from the suppliers. So I would say that's one thing, is asking the right questions at the right stage in the procurement process. So even before you go out to tender, if you're sort of assessing the market and evaluating the market and you're reaching out to suppliers, at that point start to have this conversation. Just say to them, you know, we have a commitment to this, we want to make sure that this is something that's focused on throughout our negotiation. Be prepared to come to this. And some suppliers might turn around and say, this is not something we can come to the table on, where others, they can start to prepare. They probably have a lot of information, but they don't have it readily accessible. So getting that in as soon as possible in the procurement process is really important. Where people have left it late in the day, that's where key challenges and roadblockers come up. And again, that visibility throughout the supply chain. So not having the data, obviously supply chain is very complex. If you're wanting to get really into the tiers, you've got to work with your suppliers to do that. So it's a key challenge, just expecting suppliers to know where their supply chain is. Hopefully that's answered the question for you. Any other questions? If not, thank you very much for your time this morning. Again, feel free to get in touch. But thank you very much.